If you imagine the Roman Empire at its peak, you're not imagining something small or fragile. You are imagining a system that stretched across continents, controlled tens of millions of people, and held together by roads, laws, legions, and an idea so powerful it outlived generations: Rome itself. And into this world, on April 26th, 121 AD, a child was born who would later be known as Marcus Aurelius. At the time, no one could possibly know that this child would become one of the most studied rulers in human history, not because he conquered more land than others, but because he questioned what it meant to have power in the first place. He was born into elite Roman aristocracy, the highest tier of society within the Roman Empire. His birth name was Marcus Annius Verus, and from the beginning, his life was shaped by privilege that most people in the ancient world could never even imagine. His father, also named Marcus Annius Verus, held high judicial authority in Rome. His mother came from a wealthy and influential family connected to industry and construction. In other words, Marcus did not rise from nothing. He began at the very top of Roman society. But Rome itself was not a simple place of luxury. It was a world of extremes. On one side, there was unimaginable wealth, marble villas, political power, philosophers debating in public spaces, and the hum of an empire that controlled trade routes from Britain to Egypt. On the other side, there was brutal inequality, slavery as a normal institution, overcrowded housing, public executions as entertainment, and constant reminders that human life, in many cases, had little protection if you were poor or powerless. This contradiction would later become central to Marcus' thinking. Even as a child, he was surrounded by this tension between civilization and cruelty, between order and violence, between philosophy and survival. But before he could even begin to understand the empire he was born into, tragedy struck early. His father died when Marcus was only 3 years old. At that age, there is no philosophical explanation for loss. No idea of fate or reason can soften something so immediate. And yet, in hindsight, this early encounter with mortality is often seen as one of the first silent forces that shaped him. After his father's death, Marcus was raised primarily by his grandfather, a man also deeply embedded in Roman political life. His grandfather was known for discipline, responsibility, and an unusually serious sense of duty for someone in Rome's elite class. From him, Marcus learned something that would follow him for the rest of his life. Power is not something you enjoy. It is something you carry. Education for Roman elites was intense and structured. Marcus was trained in grammar, rhetoric, philosophy, mathematics, and physical discipline. He was expected to speak well, think clearly, understand law, and eventually serve the state. But what made Marcus different was not what he was taught. It was what he seemed to naturally question. While many young aristocrats were trained to enjoy their status, Marcus showed early signs of discomfort with it. He was described as serious, reflective, and unusually uninterested in luxury or display. This is where philosophy enters his life in a meaningful way. He was introduced to different schools of thought, but one in particular began to shape his worldview deeply: Stoicism. Stoicism was not a philosophy of comfort. It was not designed to make life easier. It was designed to make the mind stronger. It taught that most things in life are outside human control: wealth, reputation, health, even death. But one thing is always within control: how a person responds. For a young Roman aristocrat, this idea was radical, because everything in his environment told him the opposite. That status mattered, that birth mattered, that control over others defined success. But Stoicism told him something completely different: that the only real measure of a human being is character. As Marcus absorbed this, another major force entered his life: politics at the highest level. Rome at this time was ruled by Emperor Hadrian. Hadrian was not just a ruler. He was a reformer, an intellectual, and a strategist who deeply understood the fragility of empire. He saw Marcus early, not as a child among many, but as someone unusual. There was something in Marcus that stood out to Hadrian: not ambition, but restraint. Not hunger for power, but seriousness about responsibility. And in a world where many future rulers were chosen through bloodline politics or military aggression, Hadrian began considering something unusual. He began thinking about succession not as inheritance, but as design. At the time, Marcus was still very young, but Roman politics was already quietly shaping his destiny. Hadrian eventually arranged a system of adoption-based succession, a method designed to ensure capable leadership rather than purely biological inheritance. This was one of Rome's most pragmatic political tools, choosing heirs based on ability and character. This system would eventually place Marcus on the path to becoming emperor. But before that happened, Marcus was still just a boy trying to understand the world he was expected to one day rule. Rome itself was massive, not just in size but in complexity. Roads connected distant provinces. Trade moved grain, wine, metals, and goods across continents. Armies guarded borders along rivers like the Danube, one of the empire's most important defensive lines, where Roman control met the pressure of northern tribes. And yet, despite all this structure, the empire was constantly under strain. Borders were never fully secure. Political alliances shifted. Disease, rebellion, and external pressure were constant realities. For Marcus, growing up inside this system meant living with a quiet awareness that stability was not permanent. It was maintained. Meanwhile, his education continued at a high level. He studied rhetoric to learn how to speak in public. He studied law to understand governance. He studied military discipline because every Roman aristocrat was expected to understand command, even if they never used it. But the most important education he received was not formal. It was observation. He watched how powerful men behaved when they believed no one could challenge them. He saw how wealth changed people. He saw how fear influenced decisions. And slowly, he began to form an internal question that would follow him into adulthood. What kind of person should someone become when they have power over others? Not how to gain power, not how to keep it, but what to do with it once it arrives. That question would define his entire life. As Marcus grew older, political decisions around him began to accelerate. Hadrian's succession planning became more complex, involving key Roman figures being adopted into positions of future authority. This was not family drama in the modern sense, but state engineering at the highest level. Eventually, a crucial figure emerged, Antoninus Pius. Antoninus was selected as a stabilizing successor, and under Hadrian's plan, he would adopt future heirs, including Marcus himself. This moment changed everything, because Marcus was no longer just a talented aristocrat. He was now being positioned inside the future structure of imperial power. But even as this political machinery moved around him, Marcus himself remained internally focused on something very different: character, discipline, and philosophical clarity. He was not preparing to become a ruler in the traditional sense. He was trying to understand how not to become corrupted by becoming one. And that tension between power and restraint, between duty and identity, between empire and philosophy, would define everything that came next. Because Marcus Aurelius was not being shaped into a conqueror. He was being shaped into something far rarer in history. A ruler who feared what power might do to his own soul. And as Rome continued its slow, complex machinery of succession, Marcus was about to step fully into a world where philosophy would no longer be theoretical. It would be tested by reality. And reality, in the Roman Empire, was never gentle. This part follows Marcus' transformation from student of philosophy into direct heir of the Roman Empire, and how years of controlled political life begin shaping the mindset of a future emperor long before he actually rules. When the political system of the Roman Empire began adjusting its succession plan under Emperor Hadrian, it was not done with emotion. It was done with calculation. Rome had learned through centuries of instability that emperors could not simply be chosen through popularity or military force alone. The wrong ruler could collapse provinces, trigger civil war, or destabilize the entire Mediterranean world. So Hadrian designed something unusual for his time: a chain of adoption where capable men were selected, trained, and placed in a succession step by step. At the center of this system was Antoninus Pius, a man chosen not for dramatic conquest or ambition, but for balance, patience, and reliability. And under Antoninus' future rule, Marcus Aurelius would be formally adopted into the imperial family, transforming his life permanently. At around 17 years old, Marcus was no longer just a promising aristocrat. He became Caesar. In Roman political structure, that title did not mean full power yet, but it meant something more important: designated future authority. It meant the empire had publicly marked him as part of its continuation. From this moment, Marcus' life stopped belonging to him in any normal sense. Every decision, every relationship, every education was now shaped by one question: does this prepare him to rule? But what makes Marcus' story unusual is that even as he moved closer to absolute power, he did not become more ambitious in the traditional sense. He became more restrained, more reflective, more aware of how dangerous unchecked authority could become. Under Antoninus Pius, Rome entered a rare period of stability. There were no massive expansion wars, no internal purges, no dramatic political upheavals. It was a controlled, carefully maintained empire. This gave Marcus something rare in imperial history: time to observe power without fully holding it, time to watch decisions being made without bearing full consequences, and time to study leadership as a living system rather than a theory. Marcus spent years attending Senate sessions, observing administrative decisions, learning how law, taxation, military logistics, and provincial governance actually functioned. What he discovered was not heroic. It was complex, slow, and often uncertain. He saw how emperors rarely had perfect information, how most decisions were made with incomplete knowledge, how outcomes were often unpredictable even when intentions were good. This shaped one of Marcus' most important philosophical realizations. Leadership is not about control, but about responsibility under uncertainty. During this time, Marcus also deepened his philosophical training under key mentors. One of the most important was Epictetus, whose teachings would reach Marcus through his students and writings. Epictetus had been a slave before becoming a philosopher, and his Stoicism was not abstract. It was practical, even harsh in its clarity. He taught that freedom comes not from external conditions, but from internal discipline. Marcus absorbed this deeply. He also studied under influential Roman intellectuals such as Marcus Cornelius Fronto, who trained him in language, persuasion, and the structure of political speech. Fronto and Marcus exchanged letters that reveal something important. Marcus was not naturally comfortable with public performance or rhetorical display. He often leaned toward introspection rather than spectacle. This created tension inside him, because Rome expected emperors to be visible, persuasive, and commanding in presence. But Marcus was becoming something different, a ruler who preferred thought over performance. And that mismatch would follow him for the rest of his life. Another major influence during this period was his close relationship with Stoic teacher Junius Rusticus. Rusticus introduced Marcus more directly to practical Stoicism, emphasizing not just thinking correctly, but living correctly under pressure. Rusticus did not treat philosophy as intellectual achievement. He treated it as discipline. And through him, Marcus began forming what would later become his private philosophical journal, the Reflections now known as his Meditations. At first, these were not literary works. They were reminders, notes to himself, short internal instructions about how to remain stable in a world that was becoming more demanding. At the same time, Marcus' personal life was also being shaped into imperial structure. He was married to Faustina the Younger, the daughter of Antoninus Pius. This marriage was political in origin, designed to strengthen dynastic continuity. But over time, it became a genuine partnership, at least in terms of shared imperial life and responsibilities. Together, they had multiple children over the years, though not all survived into adulthood, a harsh reality of ancient life even at the highest levels of society. And this constant exposure to loss would later deepen Marcus' already strong awareness of mortality. Because even emperors could not protect their families from illness. Even emperors could not control fate. As Antoninus Pius ruled, Marcus continued absorbing the structure of governance. He saw how the empire functioned as a network of provinces, governors, armies, trade systems, and legal frameworks. He learned that Rome did not survive through strength alone, but through coordination. And more importantly, he saw the hidden cost of stability. Stability required constant maintenance. It required compromise. It required decisions that were not always ideal, but necessary. This realization slowly changed Marcus' understanding of morality and leadership. Before, philosophy had often been presented as clear, right versus wrong, virtue versus vice. But governance showed him something more complicated. Sometimes choices exist between two imperfect outcomes. This is where Stoicism became more than philosophy for Marcus. It became psychological survival. It taught him to focus on intention and conduct, not outcome alone, because outcomes were often outside human control. In 161 AD, Antoninus Pius died peacefully. With his death, Marcus Aurelius officially became emperor. But what matters is what happened before that moment. Marcus was not surprised. He had been living inside imperial responsibility for years already. So when power finally transferred fully to him, there was no sudden transformation, only completion. Almost immediately, Marcus made an unusual decision. He did not rule alone. He elevated his adoptive brother Lucius Verus as co-emperor. Lucius Verus. This was not traditional Roman practice. Power in Rome was usually centralized. But Marcus believed the empire was too large for one man's capacity, and that shared responsibility would strengthen governance. This decision would define the early years of his reign. At the same time, Marcus was now confronted with reality in its most unforgiving form. Because shortly after he took power, the empire began facing crises that no amount of philosophical training could have fully prepared him for. The first was military conflict in the east, where Rome and the Parthian Empire clashed over control of Armenia and surrounding regions. The second was something far worse, something invisible and uncontrollable. A plague. The Antonine Plague began spreading across Roman territories, likely introduced through returning soldiers. Cities began to empty. Trade slowed. Armies weakened. And mortality rates rose across the entire empire. For Marcus, this was not just a political crisis. It was a philosophical shock. Stoicism teaches acceptance of nature, but it does not remove emotional weight from human suffering. Marcus now had to govern while watching death spread across his world. He responded not with retreat, but with action. He organized relief efforts, supported medical care, opened resources, and remained present in governance even as conditions worsened. But internally, this period marked a shift. Marcus' private writings begin to reflect something deeper and heavier. Not optimism, not despair, but endurance. A commitment to continue acting correctly even when outcomes are painful or unclear. At the same time, Lucius Verus led military campaigns in the east while Marcus handled administrative governance. The system surprisingly worked. Rome achieved military success, and the eastern conflict eventually ended in Roman favor. But returning soldiers brought the plague deeper into the empire, spreading it further. Victory and disaster became intertwined, and Marcus began to understand one of the hardest truths of leadership. Success does not eliminate consequence. It often multiplies it. During these years, Marcus also faced personal loss within his family, including the deaths of children, which affected him deeply but did not pull him away from duty. Instead, it reinforced his Stoic view that attachment must coexist with acceptance of impermanence. Not emotional detachment, but emotional awareness without collapse. As Marcus entered the middle phase of his reign, a pattern was forming. External crisis after crisis internal discipline increasing in response. And slowly, the emperor who once studied philosophy as a young man was becoming something different. Not a man who practiced philosophy, but a man who lived inside it under pressure. And the greatest test of that philosophy was still ahead, because the empire's northern borders were beginning to change in ways Rome had not fully anticipated. And Marcus would soon leave the city behind for something far more demanding than governance from a distance. He would go to war on the frontier himself. By the time the northern frontier began to break, Marcus Aurelius was no longer a young man shaped by philosophy and preparation. He was now the ruler of the most complex political machine the ancient world had ever built, the Roman Empire, and everything he had studied was about to be tested in a way no classroom, mentor, or Senate meeting could ever simulate. The crisis did not arrive as a single dramatic event. It came as pressure building slowly along a border that had always required attention but now demanded full attention. Along the Danube River, Roman defenses faced increasing movement from Germanic and Sarmatian tribes. These were not random raids anymore. They were coordinated, sustained, and increasingly large-scale incursions. What Rome had once treated as a manageable frontier problem was becoming something closer to a structural threat. And Marcus Aurelius, now emperor, had to make a decision that would redefine his entire reign. Stay in Rome and govern from the center of power, or go north and physically place himself at the edge of the collapsing frontier. Most emperors before him would have chosen distance. Rome was a city of administration, politics, and symbolic authority. The emperor did not need to be at the front lines to be respected, but Marcus was shaped differently. His Stoic training, reinforced over decades by teachers like Junius Rusticus, had created a very specific internal logic. Duty is not symbolic. It is physical. If suffering is real, leadership cannot remain abstract. So Marcus left Rome, not for a short inspection, but for years. He moved toward the Danube frontier, where the empire met constant pressure from tribes, such as the Marcomanni, Quadi, and others grouped loosely in what historians later call the Marcomannic Wars. What he found there was not a border in the traditional sense. It was a long, unstable zone of war, survival, and exhaustion. Roman forts stood scattered across the river. Supply lines stretched thin. Soldiers were no longer fighting in controlled campaigns, but in reactive defense against unpredictable movements. And then, layered on top of this already unstable situation, came something even worse. The plague was still moving through the empire. The same epidemic that had entered during earlier Eastern campaigns, often associated with what historians call the Antonine Plague, continued to weaken both civilian populations and military capacity. Camps became vulnerable not just to enemy attack, but to disease spreading faster than medical response could contain. Marcus now faced a reality that forced him into constant crisis management on two fronts: war without stable borders and illness without clear control. It is in this environment that Marcus' leadership begins to change in visible ways. He was no longer an emperor who observed from structured environments like Senate chambers or palace courtyards. He was now living in temporary military headquarters, moving between forts, river crossings, and frontline positions. The court followed him, but it was no longer a court in the traditional sense. It became a mobile administrative center operating in conditions closer to field command than imperial ceremony. Roman elites who had expected stability were now living in mud, cold, and uncertainty. And Marcus did not exempt himself. One of the most important details about this phase of his life is that he deliberately shared the conditions of his soldiers. He ate the same rations. He slept in similar conditions. He exposed himself to the same risks. This was not performance. It was principle. Because in Marcus' understanding of Stoicism, authority does not place a person above human experience. It places them inside responsibility. And responsibility, in his case, meant sharing the cost of decisions. During these campaigns, Marcus began writing more intensely than ever. His private reflections, later compiled into what is now known as his Meditations, were not written as literature. They were written as psychological discipline, reminders to remain stable in conditions designed to destabilize. Reminders that frustration does not improve outcomes. Reminders that even victory is temporary and even loss is not absolute. But philosophy alone did not win wars. The Roman military still had to adapt, and Marcus was forced into a level of strategic learning he had never anticipated. He worked closely with generals, analyzed enemy movement patterns, and adjusted Roman defensive structures to respond to coordinated tribal pressure rather than isolated raids. This period reveals something important about him. He was not a purely passive philosopher reacting to events. He was actively learning operational reality under pressure. At the same time, internal Roman politics still continued. His co-emperor, Lucius Verus, had led earlier Eastern campaigns successfully, but the return of those forces contributed indirectly to the spread of disease. Eventually, Lucius Verus died in 169 AD, likely due to illness, removing Marcus' political partner. From that moment forward, Marcus ruled alone, and that loneliness mattered, not emotionally in a simplistic sense, but structurally. Every decision now required singular responsibility. No shared authority, no equal partner to distribute burden. Only Marcus, and the empire did not become easier to manage. The northern wars intensified. By the early 170s, Marcus was deeply embedded in prolonged conflict along the Danube. What had once been defensive response turned into extended military campaigns aimed at stabilizing frontier control. He established forward bases and coordinated multiple legions across wide operational zones. Rome, under his leadership, was no longer simply defending territory. It was trying to restore order in a region that had become fluid and unpredictable. But while military operations continued, something else was happening inside Marcus himself. A gradual erosion of any illusion that life could be controlled into stability. His writings from this period reflect a man who has stopped expecting clarity from circumstances. Instead, he focuses on response, on maintaining ethical behavior in conditions where outcomes are uncertain, on avoiding emotional collapse when systems fail, on continuing action even when success cannot be guaranteed. This is where his philosophy becomes most distinct from traditional Stoicism as abstract theory and turns into lived endurance. Then, in the middle of this long frontier struggle, personal tragedy intensified. Marcus lost several of his children during these years, including sons whose deaths are recorded in Roman historical accounts. One of the most painful aspects of his reign is how frequently personal loss overlaps with public crisis. Because while he was managing wars on the Danube, he was also receiving news from Rome of family deaths caused by illness and instability. And he could not simply leave the front. This creates one of the most psychologically demanding situations in ancient leadership. Emotional grief combined with unbroken administrative responsibility. In 175 AD, another major internal crisis emerged when Avidius Cassius, a powerful Roman general in the eastern provinces, declared himself emperor after rumors spread that Marcus had died. Cassius controlled significant military forces and parts of the eastern administration. For a brief moment, it looked like civil war might break out. But Marcus responded with something that surprised even his closest advisors. He did not immediately rush east with punitive force. Instead, he moved to stabilize the situation politically. And when Cassius was killed by his own officers, Marcus chose reconciliation over widespread execution of supporters. This decision reinforced something consistent in his leadership style: preference for stability over revenge whenever possible. Shortly after this crisis, Marcus faced another devastating personal loss. His wife, Faustina the Younger, died in 175 AD. Historical accounts vary in tone about her life, but for Marcus, her death represented the loss of a central figure in his personal and imperial life. She had been with him through the entire transformation from heir to emperor through plague, war, and internal crisis. And now she was gone. At this point, Marcus Aurelius was governing an empire under continuous strain, managing military conflict, recovering from internal rebellion, and processing sustained personal loss. And yet he did not withdraw. Instead, he continued moving along the frontier, maintaining presence in military operations and overseeing long-term stabilization efforts. This is where his reign becomes less about political achievements and more about endurance as a form of leadership. Because nothing about this period is stable. Even victories do not create rest. Even reforms do not eliminate pressure. Everything is temporary stabilization in a system under constant strain. And Marcus understands this better than anyone. His meditations from this period reflect a deepening acceptance of impermanence. Not as an idea, but as lived structure. Everything changes. Everything decays. Everything must be maintained, not solved. Even the empire, even the self. And as the wars slowly begin to stabilize through Roman persistence, Marcus does something unusual for an emperor still in active military command. He keeps writing to himself, not speeches, not laws, but internal reminders about how to remain human inside an inhuman scale of responsibility. Because by now, he has understood something essential. The greatest danger to a ruler is not external enemies. It is internal corrosion. And the only defense against that is constant self-examination. As the northern campaigns continue to shift toward Roman advantage, Marcus Aurelius remains on the frontier, no longer a philosopher studying power, but a ruler surviving inside it. And what comes next will test not just his leadership, but the limits of endurance itself. Because even when wars stabilize, the human body does not become infinite. And even the most disciplined mind eventually meets its limit. By the time Marcus Aurelius reached the final phase of the northern wars along the Danube, something important had already changed inside the empire of the Roman Empire. It was no longer expanding in the old sense of unstoppable momentum. Instead, it was being maintained, held together, defended. And that difference, subtle at first, is one of the most important turning points in Roman history. Marcus himself, now older, exhausted, and shaped by years of continuous military command on the frontier, understood this better than anyone. The wars against the northern tribes had not produced a clean victory or a decisive collapse of enemies. Instead, they produced a pattern Rome would begin to repeat more often in the centuries ahead. Pressure, response, stabilization, and then renewed pressure. A cycle, not an endpoint. And Marcus had spent years inside that cycle. During these final campaigns, Marcus' leadership style had fully transformed from imperial administration into something closer to permanent crisis governance. He was no longer simply issuing policies from Rome. He was physically embedded in military zones along the Danube, coordinating defenses, managing logistics, and responding to constant movement across the frontier. The Emperor of Rome had effectively become a field commander of an empire in motion. But even in the middle of this, something else was happening quietly in the background. Rome was preparing for succession, because Marcus Aurelius, despite his endurance, was not eternal. And the man who would follow him was already within the system of power. His son, Commodus, had been growing up inside the imperial structure while his father spent years on campaign. And this is where the story begins to shift in tone. Marcus had been shaped by philosophy, discipline, and constant exposure to responsibility before absolute power ever fully arrived. Commodus, by contrast, was shaped inside the results of that system already functioning. He did not experience the same gradual apprenticeship and hardship that Marcus had undergone under Antoninus Pius. Instead, Commodus experienced imperial life more as inheritance than formation. This difference would matter enormously, because Marcus' entire worldview had been built on one central idea: that power must be constrained by virtue. But Commodus would inherit a system where power already existed without the same internal philosophical restraint that had defined his father's generation. As Marcus continued his final military operations along the frontier, he also began thinking increasingly about succession not as a political event, but as a philosophical problem. What happens to an empire when the mind that shaped its stability is no longer present? What happens when discipline is replaced by assumption? And what happens when authority is inherited without the same internal struggle that once gave it meaning? These were not abstract questions anymore. They were imminent reality. During this same period, Marcus made one of his most significant strategic achievements, stabilizing large sections of the northern frontier through a combination of military pressure and negotiated settlements with various tribal groups. Some were integrated as allies. Others were resettled within Roman territory under controlled conditions. And some were kept at distance through fortified defense systems that required constant maintenance. This was not the Roman expansion of earlier centuries. It was something more complex, a managed frontier, a boundary that required continuous effort to hold in place. And Marcus, despite exhaustion, remained committed to this system because he understood something most rulers ignored. An empire does not end when it loses territory. It ends when it can no longer maintain coherence. By the late 170s AD, Marcus had effectively spent more than a decade in continuous military engagement. His body was no longer in its former condition. Illness, exhaustion, and the accumulated weight of years of leadership had begun to define his physical state. And yet he continued working, continuing decisions, continuing governance, continuing presence. This is where his philosophy becomes fully embodied. Stoicism, in Marcus' case, was no longer a theoretical framework. It was a method of survival under sustained pressure. His private writings from this period reflect not triumph, but endurance without illusion. He does not write as someone who believes life will become easier. He writes as someone who has accepted that difficulty is structural, not temporary, and that the only real question is how to remain correct in action while living inside that structure. But while Marcus was focused on stabilizing the frontier, Rome itself was quietly preparing for transition. In 180 AD, Marcus Aurelius died while on campaign, not in the city of Rome, not in ceremonial surroundings, but in a military context surrounded by the environment that had defined the final decade of his life. His death marked the end of an era, not just politically but philosophically, because Marcus had represented something rare in imperial history, a ruler who actively interrogated the moral meaning of power while holding absolute authority. And with his death, that balance disappeared. Immediately, Commodus became sole emperor. At first, there was no resistance. The transition was smooth in administrative terms, because Rome had learned over generations how to maintain continuity of rule. But beneath that surface stability, something fundamental was changing, because Commodus did not inherit Marcus' internal discipline. He inherited structure without the same internal philosophical foundation that had shaped his father's decisions. At this moment, Rome begins to shift in a subtle but important way. Under Marcus, power had been treated as responsibility first, authority second. Under Commodus, that relationship would gradually begin to invert, and that inversion would have consequences far beyond his reign. But to understand why this matters, it is important to see Marcus' legacy not as a single life ending, but as a system passing into a different internal logic. Because Marcus did not just govern an empire. He modeled a way of thinking about leadership. That strength is self-control, not domination. That duty is more important than comfort. And that power must constantly be examined, not assumed. When that mindset is present at the top, the system behaves differently. When it is absent, even the same institutions begin to function in new ways. And that is what begins to happen after 180 AD. But this is not the end of the Roman story. In fact, it is the beginning of a new phase entirely. Because as Commodus' rule develops, internal tensions within the empire begin to reveal pressures that had always existed but were previously contained by disciplined leadership. Military authority starts to separate from philosophical restraint. Political ambition begins to reassert itself more aggressively, and the balance between emperor, army, and Senate becomes less stable. At the same time, external pressures along the frontiers do not disappear. The same northern regions Marcus spent years stabilizing remain active zones of negotiation, conflict, and shifting alliances. Rome is still powerful, but it is no longer guided by the same internal psychological framework that Marcus embodied. And this is where the larger historical transition becomes visible. Because Marcus Aurelius represents the peak of one type of imperial logic, a ruler deeply embedded in stoic restraint governing a complex system with constant self-questioning. Commodus represents the beginning of a different phase, where inherited authority no longer carries the same philosophical weight, and where personal interpretation of power becomes more dominant. This shift does not immediately collapse Rome, but it changes its trajectory. And from here, the story naturally expands beyond Marcus himself, because what follows is not just the life of one emperor, but the transformation of an entire system over time. The Roman world, after Marcus, begins to move toward a different kind of instability, one that will later lead into larger crises, reforms, and eventually the restructuring of imperial power under later emperors. And if we continue forward from here, the next chapter is no longer about Marcus alone. It becomes about what happens to empires when the philosophy that stabilized them begins to fade from leadership, and how systems react when the internal discipline that once guided decision-making is replaced by something far less predictable. That is where the story moves next, not away from Marcus Aurelius, but outward from him, into the Rome that follows, and into the consequences of what happens when one of history's most self-reflective rulers is no longer at the center of the system he helped define. After the death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 AD, the Roman world did not collapse, at least not immediately. The Roman Empire was too large, too structured, and too experienced at surviving transitions of power to fall apart overnight. But something more subtle began to change. The center of gravity inside the empire shifted. Under Marcus, imperial authority had been shaped by a constant internal question: how should power be used responsibly? Under his successor, Commodus, that question gradually weakened in importance, replaced instead by a more immediate focus on personal authority, survival, and political control. Commodus inherited a system that still functioned on the surface. Armies were organized, provinces were governed, taxation continued, and the Senate still met in formal structure. But the internal philosophy that had guided decision-making under Marcus was no longer central to leadership. And that difference matters more than most historical turning points, because empires do not change only through wars or revolutions. They change when the mindset of leadership changes. Commodus had grown up inside imperial life, but not through the same long apprenticeship in hardship, responsibility, and philosophical discipline that had shaped Marcus during his years under Antoninus Pius. Instead, Commodus entered power already surrounded by the symbols of authority without the same internal framework that had once constrained it. And slowly, the structure of Rome began to reflect that shift. In the early years of his reign, Commodus initially maintained continuity. Advisors from Marcus' administration still held influence. Military structures remained intact. Frontier systems along the Danube and elsewhere continued functioning under established protocols. But over time, Commodus began to centralize authority more personally. Decision-making became less collaborative. Political relationships became more transactional. And imperial symbolism increasingly focused on the emperor himself rather than the broader idea of Roman civic duty. This is where the contrast with Marcus Aurelius becomes especially important. Marcus had treated imperial power as something external to himself that required constant internal correction. Commodus began to treat imperial power as something inherently personal, not just a role to perform, but an identity to express. This shift, subtle at first, gradually influenced how authority was exercised across the empire. The Senate, once an important advisory and legitimizing institution, began to lose practical influence. Governors and military leaders became more directly dependent on imperial favor, and political stability increasingly relied on proximity to the emperor rather than institutional balance. At the same time, Rome's frontier situation did not disappear. The Danube and Rhine borders, still shaped by the legacy of Marcus campaigns, remained zones of tension and negotiation with Germanic tribes and other regional groups. But the nature of response began to change. Where Marcus had emphasized sustained coordination and long-term stabilization, later administration under Commodus became more inconsistent, influenced by shifting internal priorities and court dynamics. This did not immediately undo Roman control, but it introduced variability into systems that had previously been carefully managed. And variability, in large empires, is often the beginning of structural stress. Inside Rome itself, political life began to reflect increasing uncertainty. Imperial favor became more volatile. Court politics gained importance. Loyalty networks shifted more frequently, and the symbolic distance between emperor and political elite widened. Commodus also began to distance himself from the philosophical framing that had been so central to Marcus' identity. Where Marcus had written private reflections on discipline, mortality, and duty, Commodus leaned more toward personal expression of authority and spectacle. Over time, imperial identity became less connected to Stoic self-restraint and more connected to visibility and personal control. This shift had consequences beyond philosophy. It affected governance style. It affected decision-making speed. And it affected how stability itself was maintained. Because under Marcus, stability had been something actively maintained through constant internal correction. Under Commodus, stability increasingly became something expected to persist through existing structure, rather than something continuously reinforced through disciplined leadership. And that assumption is one of the most dangerous points in imperial history. Because systems that are actively maintained can absorb pressure. Systems that are assumed to maintain themselves eventually begin to drift. By the late 180s AD, internal tensions within Rome became more visible. Political relationships at the imperial court became more unstable. Military command structures began to experience shifts in loyalty, and administrative decisions increasingly reflected the influence of personal proximity to power rather than consistent institutional logic. None of this happened in a single moment. It accumulated, slowly, layer by layer. Meanwhile, the memory of Marcus Aurelius remained present in the background of Roman political consciousness, not just as a former emperor, but as a reference point for what disciplined leadership had once looked like. His writings, later preserved and studied, continue to circulate among intellectual and political circles, reinforcing an image of a ruler who combined absolute power with internal restraint. This contrast became more pronounced over time, as later governance diverged from that model. But it is important not to simplify this transition as a simple moral decline. Rome did not suddenly fall apart. Instead, it entered a different mode of operation. One where leadership style varied more, where internal political dynamics became more complex, and where the balance between institutional stability and personal authority became more delicate. Commodus' reign eventually ended violently in 192 AD, marking another turning point in Roman history. But by that time, the transformation had already begun. The system Marcus Aurelius had once governed was no longer operating under the same internal philosophy that had defined his era. And from that point forward, Roman history begins to move into a new phase. A phase where emperors change more frequently, where military influence becomes more pronounced in political transitions, and where the idea of imperial stability becomes increasingly dependent on factors outside any single ruler's control. But to understand this shift fully, it is important to see it not as an isolated failure, but as part of a longer structural evolution. Because what Marcus Aurelius represented was not just one emperor among many. He represented a specific moment in Roman history where philosophy, governance, and personal discipline aligned inside a single individual at the highest level of power. And when that alignment ended, the system did not immediately collapse. It adapted, changed, and gradually moved into a different form of imperial reality. In the centuries that followed, Rome would continue to transform through crisis, reform, division, and eventual restructuring into later imperial forms. But the memory of Marcus Aurelius remained significant because it represented something rare. The idea that absolute power could be held alongside continuous self-examination. And as later generations looked back on this period, the question was no longer only about what Marcus did as emperor. It became about what happens to empires when that kind of internal discipline is no longer central to leadership. Because after Marcus Aurelius, Rome did not simply continue as before. It began to reveal what it looks like when an empire transitions from philosophical governance to purely structural survival. And that transition would shape everything that came next in Roman history. After the assassination of Commodus in 192 AD, Rome did not regain stability. It entered something far more chaotic, a phase where imperial power no longer followed a clean line of succession, but began to fracture into competing claims, military endorsements, and short-lived political settlements. The Roman Empire was still intact geographically, but politically it was becoming unstable in a way that earlier centuries had only hinted at. What followed Commodus' death is often remembered as the beginning of rapid imperial turnover, where emperors rise and fall in quick succession, often supported by different military factions or political alliances rather than long-term legitimacy. But to understand this phase properly, it is important to connect it back to what came before. Because under Marcus Aurelius, imperial stability had been maintained through a combination of disciplined governance, philosophical restraint, and careful institutional balance. When that internal philosophy weakened, the system did not immediately collapse. Instead, it began to lose consistency. And over time, inconsistency becomes fragmentation. After Commodus, multiple claimants to the throne emerged almost immediately. Power was no longer transferred through carefully managed succession alone, but through a combination of Senate recognition, military backing, and regional influence. In 193 AD, a year later, Rome experienced what historians often describe as a rapid succession of emperors in what became a political and military struggle for control of the state. This period is often associated with figures such as Septimius Severus, who eventually emerged as a dominant ruler after defeating rivals. But what matters most is not individual names at this stage. It is the structural reality that Rome was now experiencing. Imperial authority was no longer unified by internal consensus. It was being actively contested, and that contest reshaped how power functioned. Under Marcus Aurelius, legitimacy had been reinforced by a shared sense of duty, institutional continuity, and philosophical framing of leadership. After him, legitimacy became increasingly tied to force, control of legions, and short-term political dominance. This shift did not happen because Rome suddenly forgot how to govern. It happened because the stabilizing internal framework had weakened, and no replacement system had fully taken its place. In the decades that followed, the empire entered what is often referred to as a long period of internal crisis and restructuring. Emperors changed frequently. Military commands gained more direct political influence, and regional authorities began to exercise greater autonomy in response to instability at the center. The empire was still Roman, but it was no longer behaving as a single coherent political organism in the same way it had under Marcus Aurelius. Instead, it functioned more like a system under continuous stress, adjusting itself repeatedly to prevent total breakdown. And this is where the story begins to shift from individuals to structure. Because after Marcus Aurelius, the central question is no longer who is the emperor. It becomes, how does an empire survive when leadership becomes unstable? One of the most important responses to this instability came under later emperors who attempted to restore order through administrative restructuring and military reform. One of the most significant figures in this process was Septimius Severus, who established stronger military control over imperial succession and reinforced the role of the army in political legitimacy. This marked a major shift in Roman political identity. Where earlier systems had balanced Senate authority, imperial tradition, and military power, the post-Marcus period increasingly leaned toward military-centered legitimacy. In practical terms, this meant that armies were no longer just instruments of state policy. They became active participants in determining who held the state itself. At the same time, regional pressures continued to increase along the frontiers that Marcus had once personally stabilized through sustained campaigns. Germanic groups along the Rhine and Danube, eastern pressures near Parthian and later Sasanian territories, and internal economic strain all contributed to a more volatile environment. The empire did not stop functioning, but it required constant adaptation. Governors, generals, and administrators had to respond to local conditions more flexibly, sometimes with significant autonomy from central authority. This created a paradox. Rome remained unified in name, but increasingly decentralized in practice. And that decentralization was not planned. It was reactive, a response to instability rather than a designed evolution. Meanwhile, the legacy of Marcus Aurelius continued to exist in the background of Roman intellectual and political life. His writings, preserved and copied over time, became a reference point for later thinkers who looked back at his reign as an example of disciplined leadership under extreme pressure. Not because his era was peaceful, but because it represented a rare alignment between philosophical reflection and executive authority. Later rulers, facing very different conditions, would often be judged implicitly against that standard. But structurally, the empire had moved into a different phase. A phase where survival depended less on philosophical coherence and more on adaptive power distribution. This transition eventually leads into what historians describe as the later crisis period, where external invasions, internal political fragmentation, and economic strain converge more visibly. But even that crisis is not a single collapse. It is a long process of restructuring, new administrative divisions, shifts in military organization, changes in taxation and resource distribution, and repeated attempts to recenter authority in ways that could restore stability. In this sense, Rome does not end after Marcus Aurelius. It transforms from a system partially stabilized by philosophical governance into a system that must now rely on institutional adaptation alone. And that is the deeper turning point, because Marcus represented a rare moment where personal philosophy and imperial structure reinforced each other. After him, Rome continues without that alignment, and everything that follows is shaped by that absence, not as immediate failure, but as long-term drift. A drift that gradually changes how power works, how authority is maintained, and how an empire understands itself. And in the larger arc of history, this is the key lesson that emerges from the post-Marcus world. Empires do not only fall through defeat, they also change through the loss of internal principles that once made their complexity manageable. From here, the story can continue into the later reforms of the Roman state, the eventual restructuring under Diocletian, or even the transformation into a divided imperial system in the centuries that follow. But at its core, all of it traces back to one transition point, when Rome moved from the disciplined, reflective leadership style of Marcus Aurelius into a period where survival depended on constant structural adaptation without the same philosophical center. And that shift is what defines the next chapter of Roman history. By the time Rome entered what historians later call the crisis of the 3rd century, the changes that began after Marcus Aurelius had fully matured into something far more severe than simple political instability. The Roman Empire was still vast in geography, still culturally Roman in identity, but politically it was now operating under extreme strain. What had once been a relatively stable imperial system anchored by long reigns and structured succession was now experiencing rapid turnover of emperors, regional fragmentation, and overlapping claims to authority. In practical terms, the empire was no longer functioning as a single, stable center of power. This did not happen suddenly. It was the accumulation of earlier shifts. After the death of Marcus Aurelius, Rome had already begun transitioning away from leadership grounded in long-term philosophical discipline and toward more immediate, force-driven political control. Under later rulers, especially following the collapse of stability after Commodus, this transition accelerated. By the mid-200s AD, the empire was facing simultaneous pressures that reinforced each other. External invasions intensified along multiple frontiers. Germanic groups pressed deeper into Roman territory from the north, while Eastern conflicts continued to challenge imperial resources. At the same time, internal political legitimacy weakened as emperors were increasingly proclaimed by military units rather than established institutional processes. This created a cycle. Military instability produced political instability, and political instability made military coordination more difficult. And the empire began to fracture under the weight of its own size. In some regions, local commanders began to operate with increasing independence simply to maintain order. In others, rival claimants to imperial authority established parallel administrations. At one point, the empire effectively split into competing regional power centers, not formally declared as separate states, but functioning that way in practice. One of the most significant examples of this fragmentation was the emergence of breakaway regional systems in the West and East, where local leadership structures This was not ideological rebellion in the modern sense. It was practical survival. The central imperial system was too unstable to guarantee consistent protection or administration, so regions adapted locally. Meanwhile, the Roman economy was under severe pressure. Continuous warfare disrupted trade routes. Military expenditure increased significantly due to constant campaigning and defensive needs. And population strain from disease and conflict reduced overall economic productivity in several regions. The combination of these factors created a situation where the empire was not collapsing in a single dramatic moment, but was instead being stretched beyond its earlier capacity for centralized control. This is one of the key differences between earlier Roman crises and this period. Earlier challenges, even severe ones, were typically resolved through consolidation under strong leadership. But in this period, the scale and frequency of crises exceeded the system's ability to re-centralize quickly. And so the empire adapted in a different way. Instead of collapsing, it began reorganizing itself while under pressure. One of the most important turning points in this process came with the rise of later reforming emperors who attempted to restore stability through structural redesign rather than traditional restoration. These reforms did not immediately solve the crisis, but they began reshaping the imperial system into something new. The most important of these reforms came under Diocletian, who introduced a fundamentally different approach to imperial governance. Rather than relying on a single center of authority, he expanded the structure of rule to distribute administrative and military responsibility across multiple imperial figures. This system, later known as the Tetrarchy, divided imperial authority in a way that reflected the reality that a single ruler could no longer effectively manage the entire empire under constant external pressure. This was not an ideological departure from Rome's identity. It was a structural response to survival conditions. Under this system, the empire was divided into regions governed by multiple emperors working in coordination rather than a single centralized ruler attempting to manage everything alone. This represented a major evolution in Roman governance, because it acknowledged something that earlier imperial systems, including the one Marcus Aurelius had operated within, had not fully institutionalized. Scale requires distributed control, and when that realization becomes formal policy, the nature of empire itself changes. In this later phase, Rome becomes less about unified personal authority and more about coordinated administrative systems operating across vast geography. The philosophical tone of Marcus Aurelius' era, where internal discipline and personal virtue were central to leadership identity, becomes less directly visible in governance. Instead, structure, coordination, and enforcement become dominant themes. But even as the system changed, the legacy of earlier Rome did not disappear. The memory of Marcus Aurelius' style of leadership continued to influence how later thinkers and administrators reflected on power, especially in relation to stability and ethical governance. His writings remained a reference point for introspection, even in a world that was now far more structurally complex and militarized. Meanwhile, the empire continued to evolve. Eventually, another major transformation occurred under Constantine, who further centralized authority and integrated new ideological frameworks into imperial identity, including the increasing role of Christianity in state structure. This introduced yet another layer of transformation, shifting Rome from its earlier classical identity into a new imperial form that would influence medieval and later European political structures. But all of these later developments share a common origin point: the structural transition that began after Marcus Aurelius. Because Marcus represents the last moment in Roman history where the old imperial system, philosophical discipline, and long-form stability still aligned in a relatively coherent way. After him, Rome does not stop existing, but it stops existing in the same form. It becomes something more adaptive, more fragmented, more structurally flexible, and more dependent on continuous reform. In that sense, the story of Rome after Marcus Aurelius is not a story of simple decline. It is a story of transformation under pressure, a system that refuses to disappear, but also refuses to remain unchanged. And that is what makes this entire historical arc important, because it shows that empires are not static entities. They are processes. And when the internal philosophy that once guided those processes changes, the structure itself begins to evolve. From Marcus Aurelius' disciplined, reflective model of leadership, to Commodus' inheritance-driven authority, to the fragmented crises of the 3rd century, to the reorganized imperial systems of later reformers, Rome moves through multiple identities while still calling itself Rome. And that continuity inside transformation is what defines its historical legacy. By the time the Roman world reaches the reign of Constantine the Great, the empire is no longer the same political system that existed under Marcus Aurelius. The Roman Empire still exists in name, still controls vast territories, still commands armies and administers provinces, but its internal identity has changed in ways that would have been difficult to imagine during the Stoic emperor's lifetime. The transformation that began after Marcus Aurelius had moved through multiple phases: military fragmentation, administrative restructuring, and repeated attempts at centralized reform. Now, under Constantine, it enters a new stage entirely. Not just political reorganization, but ideological transformation. Before this period, Roman imperial identity was grounded in a mixture of traditional civic authority, military power, and evolving administrative systems. Even when emperors ruled with different styles, the underlying framework remained broadly consistent. Rome was a polytheistic imperial system that derived legitimacy from tradition, law, and military stability. But under Constantine, something shifts. Christianity, which had existed for centuries as a minority religion within the empire, begins to move into a central position in imperial identity. This does not happen instantly, and it is not a simple replacement of one belief system with another. It is a gradual process of political recognition, legal restructuring, and cultural integration. Constantine's reign marks the beginning of Christianity becoming legally protected and increasingly influential within Roman public life. This culminates in the Edict of Milan in 313 AD, which granted religious tolerance to Christians and ended widespread persecution. This moment is often treated as a turning point in religious history, but it is also a structural turning point in imperial governance. Because now, for the first time, Roman authority is being expressed through an officially recognized ideological framework that extends beyond traditional civic religion. And this changes how legitimacy is understood. Under earlier emperors like Marcus Aurelius, legitimacy was tied to duty, philosophical restraint, and the stability of governance. Even though Marcus himself was deeply committed to Stoic philosophy, he did not impose a single ideological system on the entire empire. His approach to religion was traditional Roman in structure, pluralistic, civic, and integrated into state function. Under Constantine, legitimacy begins to incorporate a more centralized religious dimension. The emperor is no longer just a political and military leader. He becomes increasingly associated with divine favor within a specific religious framework. This shift does not eliminate Rome's earlier systems overnight, but it adds a new layer on top of them. And over time, that layer becomes more structurally important. At the same time, Constantine also continues the administrative transformations that began during the crisis of the 3rd century. The empire is reorganized into more manageable administrative units. Military and civil authority are more clearly separated in many regions. The capital itself is strategically relocated, most famously with the foundation of Constantinople, a new imperial center in the eastern part of the empire. This is not just a symbolic decision. It reflects a long-term structural reality. The eastern regions of the empire had become increasingly important economically, politically, and strategically. By shifting the center of imperial power eastward, Constantine is effectively acknowledging the changing geography of Roman strength. But this also means that the empire is no longer centered in the same way it once was. Rome, as a city, remains symbolically important, but imperial governance becomes more distributed across multiple centers of power. And this distribution continues the trend that began after Marcus Aurelius. The movement away from a single concentrated imperial identity toward a more complex, multi-centered system. At this point in the story, it becomes clear that Marcus Aurelius represents the end of one kind of Roman world, not because everything collapses immediately after him, but because the underlying structure of leadership begins to evolve into something different. Under Marcus, the emperor is still the central philosophical and administrative anchor of the system. After him, especially by the time of Constantine, the emperor becomes part of a more layered structure that includes administrative reforms, religious integration, and regional power distribution. This does not mean the empire is weaker in every sense. In some ways, it becomes more adaptable. But it does mean that the simplicity of earlier imperial identity is gone. And what replaces it is more complex, more institutional, and more ideologically structured. Over time, this evolution continues. The later Roman world becomes increasingly shaped by Christian imperial ideology, administrative specialization, and regional differentiation between eastern and western parts of the empire. Eventually, this leads to a formal division between what becomes the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire, often referred to in historical terms as the Byzantine continuation. But even that division is not a sudden break. It is the culmination of long-term structural divergence that began during earlier periods of crisis and reform. And if we trace that divergence back far enough, we return again to the earlier turning point, the transition after Marcus Aurelius. Because Marcus represents the last moment when Roman imperial power was still deeply connected to a unified philosophical and administrative identity centered on a single ruler who actively reflected on the moral weight of authority. After him, the empire continues, transforms, and adapts. But it no longer operates within that same internal framework. Instead, it evolves through layers. Military restructuring after Commodus. Crisis fragmentation in the 3rd century. Institutional reform under Diocletian. Ideological transformation under Constantine. And long-term regional divergence afterward. Each stage builds on the previous one, but also moves further away from the earlier Stoic imperial synthesis that Marcus embodied. And this is why his story remains so central in historical reflection. not because it represents the end of Rome, but because it represents a moment where Rome still believed that leadership could be grounded in internal discipline, philosophical reflection, and moral accountability at the highest level of power. After that moment, the empire does not lose power, but it gains complexity, and complexity changes everything. Because systems that are simple enough to be governed by a single philosophical framework eventually give way to systems that require layered institutions, distributed authority, and evolving ideological foundations. And that is exactly what happens to Rome. From Marcus Aurelius onward, the empire does not stop. It transforms into something structurally different while still preserving its name, its legacy, and its cultural identity. And in that transformation, we see one of the most important patterns in history. Empires do not end only when they fall. They also end when they become something else entirely. By the time the long transformation of the Roman Empire reaches its later stages, something important becomes clear. Rome does not disappear in a single moment. It dissolves gradually into different forms of itself. Administrative, cultural, religious, and political layers shift over centuries, until what remains is no longer the same type of empire that once expanded under the Republic or stabilized under early imperial rule. And yet, the name Rome continues to exist across these transformations. Even as the structure underneath, it changes repeatedly. This is why the figure of Marcus Aurelius remains so important in historical reflection. Not because his reign prevented change, but because it represents one of the clearest moments in which the empire still functioned under a unified internal philosophy of leadership. Under Marcus, imperial authority was still deeply connected to a specific idea. That power is responsibility, and responsibility must be governed by self-discipline. That idea did not disappear immediately after him, but it gradually lost its central position as later emperors faced different conditions. After the political fragmentation following Commodus, the empire moved through cycles of crisis, reform, and reorganization. Under later restructuring, especially during the reign of Diocletian, the empire was divided into more manageable administrative regions, with shared imperial authority designed to handle the overwhelming scale of governance. This was not a rejection of Rome's identity. It was an adaptation to reality. The empire had become too large, too complex, and too exposed to external pressure to be governed in the same way as before. So it changed itself. Later, under Constantine the Great, another major transformation occurred, as imperial authority became increasingly integrated with Christian institutional frameworks. This introduced a new dimension to Roman identity, where governance, legitimacy, and religious structure began to overlap in ways that were not present in earlier centuries. Over time, this contributed to a gradual divergence between the western and eastern regions of the empire, leading to different administrative trajectories that would later be described as separate imperial continuities. But throughout all of this transformation, something from Marcus Aurelius' era continued to persist in a different form, not as political structure, but as intellectual legacy. His personal writings, later preserved and studied, became one of the most enduring philosophical records of ancient leadership. They were not written for public display, but for internal discipline. Short reflections on how to think, act, and endure under pressure. And because of that, they survived differently than political documents or formal decrees. They survived as human reflection inside imperial authority. In later centuries, when the Roman world had already transformed significantly, Marcus' writings were read not as administrative records, but as philosophical guidance. Especially his emphasis on focusing on what is within control, accepting external uncertainty, and maintaining ethical clarity under pressure. These ideas continued to influence later thinkers far beyond the Roman imperial system itself. Because by the time Rome had fully transformed into its later forms, including what is often referred to as the Byzantine continuation in the East, the original Stoic imperial synthesis of Marcus Aurelius was no longer structurally present in governance, but remained present in thought. And that is where its legacy becomes most visible. not in institutions, but in reflection. Marcus Aurelius becomes, in historical memory, less a figure of conquest or political expansion and more a symbol of internal governance under external pressure. A ruler who did not treat philosophy as separate from leadership, but as part of it. And this is why his story continues to be revisited long after the specific structures of his empire have changed. Because it raises a question that remains relevant even outside of Rome. What does it mean to lead something larger than yourself without losing internal clarity? What does it mean to hold authority while continuously examining how that authority affects your judgment? And what happens when systems become so large and complex that they can no longer be governed by a single internal philosophy alone? The later Roman world answers these questions not with one solution, but with multiple adaptations. Administrative restructuring under Diocletian, ideological integration under Constantine, regional divergence between Eastern and Western governance, and long-term transformation into new political and cultural systems. But none of these developments erase the earlier foundation. They build on top of it, layer after layer. And at the bottom of that historical structure remains a period where one emperor tried to align personal discipline with imperial responsibility in a way that would influence how later generations think about leadership. Even as the empire changes beyond recognition, the intellectual imprint of Marcus Aurelius remains one of its most enduring contributions. Because empires are not only defined by their borders or armies, they are also defined by the ideas their leaders leave behind about how power should be used. And in that sense, Marcus Aurelius represents a turning point that extends far beyond Rome itself. He marks the moment when imperial authority was still deeply connected to philosophical self-examination. After him, Rome evolves into something more administratively complex, more ideologically layered, and more structurally adaptive. But the question he embodied does not disappear. It simply moves beyond the empire. How does a human being remain stable, rational, and ethical in the presence of overwhelming responsibility and uncertainty? That question continues to exist long after Rome has changed. And that is why his story remains one of the most enduring narratives in ancient history. Not because it explains the fall of Rome, but because it captures a moment when leadership, philosophy, and human limitation still existed inside the same person at the highest level of power. By the time the long transformation of the Roman Empire moves into its later centuries, something subtle but important has already happened. Rome is no longer the only center of its own influence. Even as imperial structures continue to evolve under figures like Constantine the Great and later administrative systems, Roman identity begins to spread outward in ways that no longer depend solely on political control. Law, language, military organization, and administrative logic continue to shape regions far beyond the original imperial core. But alongside all of this structural legacy, another kind of influence begins to move even further beyond the borders of Rome itself. Philosophical influence. And at the center of that philosophical inheritance remains Marcus Aurelius. Not as a ruler whose decisions shaped immediate post-imperial politics, but as a figure whose private way of thinking becomes increasingly important to later generations trying to understand authority, suffering, and stability. Because unlike many emperors whose legacy is tied primarily to military victories or administrative reforms, Marcus left behind something different. A written internal system of thought. His reflections, later preserved and transmitted through manuscript traditions, were not designed as public doctrine. They were personal notes written in the middle of responsibility, war, illness, and political pressure. And this gives them a different kind of longevity. As the political structure of Rome continues to evolve, eventually splitting into different administrative continuities in the East and West, Marcus' writings begin to circulate more widely in intellectual traditions that are no longer strictly tied to Roman state governance. They become part of a broader philosophical inheritance, especially through the continued transmission of Stoic ideas, originally rooted in earlier Greek philosophy and later developed within Roman intellectual life. One of the most important aspects of this transmission is that Stoicism does not depend on imperial structure to remain relevant. It is portable. It can be applied in courts, military camps, administrative offices, or completely different civilizations that inherit Roman intellectual influence indirectly. And this is where Marcus Aurelius becomes especially important in the long arc of history, because he represents a version of leadership where philosophy is not separate from governance, but embedded within it. Even though later Roman political systems evolve into more complex administrative and religious structures under rulers like Diocletian, the internal question Marcus constantly returns to in his writings remains independent of any specific system. How do you act correctly when you cannot control outcomes? That question does not belong only to Rome. It becomes part of later intellectual traditions that extend far beyond the empire itself. As centuries pass, Roman political structures transform significantly. The western regions eventually decline into fragmented successor kingdoms, while Eastern administrative continuity persists in a different imperial form often associated with Byzantine governance. But even as political identity shifts, Roman legal, administrative, and philosophical influence continues to shape later European and Mediterranean societies. And within that long transition, Marcus Aurelius occupies a unique position. He is not remembered as a founder of institutions that survived unchanged. He is remembered as a ruler whose internal discipline became a reference point for later thinking about leadership under pressure. In later historical reflection, especially in periods far removed from ancient Rome, his writings are often revisited during times of political instability or personal uncertainty, not because they offer technical solutions to governance, but because they address something more fundamental: the psychological reality of responsibility. That reality does not change even when political systems do. Whether in imperial courts, military administrations, or entirely different civilizations that later encounter Stoic thought through translation and preservation, the core idea remains the same. External conditions are unstable, but internal response can be disciplined. And this is where the connection between Rome's transformation and Marcus Aurelius' legacy becomes most visible. Because as the empire becomes more complex, more divided, and more structurally adaptive, his writings become less about Rome specifically and more about human cognition under pressure. They shift from being indirectly imperial reflections to being universally applicable ethical exercises. Meanwhile, the broader Roman world continues to evolve. Administrative systems become more localized. Military organization becomes more regionally responsive. Religious and cultural frameworks diversify as Christianity becomes increasingly central in many regions. Under Constantine's earlier reforms, religion had already become part of imperial structure in a way that would have been structurally unfamiliar in Marcus' early reign. And over time, this integration deepens, reshaping how authority is understood not just politically, but culturally. But even in this changing environment, Marcus Aurelius remains a reference point for a different style of leadership, one that emphasizes internal accountability over external projection. And that distinction becomes more important as time moves further away from his era, because later political systems that inherit Roman influence are no longer operating under the same imperial conditions he governed. They're dealing with different scales, different institutions, and different ideological frameworks. Yet his writings remain relevant because they're not dependent on empire-specific structures. They're dependent on experience, pressure, uncertainty, responsibility, loss, and decision-making under incomplete information. These conditions repeat across history in different forms, which is why Marcus Aurelius continues to reappear in intellectual discussions long after the Roman imperial system has changed, not as a symbol of conquest, but as a symbol of internal stability in unstable systems. And this is where the larger narrative we have been following begins to widen even further, because the story is no longer only about Rome transitioning from one political form to another. It becomes about how ideas survive structural collapse and transformation. Rome changes. Its institutions evolve. Its territories shift. But certain ways of thinking persist through text, memory, and interpretation. And Marcus Aurelius becomes one of the clearest examples of that persistence. A ruler whose empire eventually transforms into something very different from what he ruled, but whose internal reflections continue to circulate far beyond the lifespan of that system. And as we move further forward in this historical arc, the focus begins to shift less on Rome as a political entity and more on the long afterlife of its ideas. How Stoic thought spreads beyond imperial boundaries. How Roman administrative logic influences later governance systems. And how figures like Marcus Aurelius become reference points for leadership under pressure across entirely different eras. This is where the story naturally expands again, not as continuation of Rome alone, but as continuation of its intellectual legacy moving through time, long after the political structure that produced it has already transformed. As the political structure of the Roman Empire continues to evolve into its later forms, something important begins happening outside its borders. Rome stops being only an empire. It becomes a model, not a single system that controls everything, but a reference point that other powers begin to absorb, imitate, and adapt in their own ways. Even as the Eastern imperial tradition continues under rulers shaped by the reforms of Constantine the Great and later administrative systems, new powers rise around the former Roman world that are no longer Roman in identity, but still carry fragments of Roman structure. Military organization, road systems, taxation methods, and even legal principles begin to appear in modified forms across emerging kingdoms and successor states. But alongside this administrative inheritance, another type of legacy spreads even more unpredictably. The legacy of disciplined warfare. Because one of the most enduring exports of Rome is not just its governance, but its way of organizing soldiers, logistics, and battlefield endurance. And this is where the world after Rome begins to fill with new kinds of conflicts. Across the former frontiers of the empire, different warrior cultures rise and adapt to the vacuum left by Roman contraction in some regions and reorganization in others. In the northern territories, Germanic and steppe influence groups that had once been external pressure on Rome now begin forming their own structured kingdoms. These are not simple tribal societies anymore. They are evolving political military systems, shaped in part by long contact with Roman armies. In the east, imperial continuities maintain more centralized control, preserving Roman administrative traditions while adapting them to new political realities. And across this broader world, warfare itself begins to change. No longer is there a single dominant imperial force defining military standards across the entire region. Instead, multiple competing systems emerge, each learning from the others. And in this environment, something interesting happens. Roman discipline does not disappear. It diffuses. Even in places where Rome no longer directly governs, its military logic survives in altered form. Cohort-based organization becomes localized command structures. Roman road networks become strategic arteries for later campaigns. Fortified cities continue to function as defensive and administrative centers. And the idea of professionalized, structured military service continues to influence how armies are built. But these new warrior societies do not simply copy Rome. They reinterpret it. And that reinterpretation leads to a new era of conflict, where Roman-style organization meets different cultural approaches to warfare. Some of the most powerful successor groups combine Roman logistical discipline with their own traditions of mobility, cavalry warfare, and kin-based loyalty systems. This fusion creates armies that are no longer Roman, but still carry traces of Roman efficiency embedded within them. At the same time, older imperial regions continue to maintain more formalized military hierarchies, preserving continuity in command structures and strategic planning. So across this changing landscape, warfare becomes a mixture of inherited Roman systems and newly evolving regional practices. And in this world of shifting power, one theme remains constant. Survival depends on adaptation. This is where the influence of earlier Roman leadership styles becomes indirectly visible again. Even though Marcus Aurelius is no longer a political actor in this period, the type of disciplined thinking associated with his era continues to echo in how leaders approach crisis management, not as direct imitation, but as structural memory. Because the Roman system he once governed had emphasized organization under pressure, layered command responsibility, and endurance through prolonged crisis. Those principles continue to survive in later military systems, even as the ideological framework around them changes. Meanwhile, large-scale conflicts across post-Roman regions become increasingly complex. Instead of single decisive imperial wars, there are now overlapping campaigns involving multiple factions, shifting alliances, and regional power struggles. Control over territory is no longer permanent. It is negotiated repeatedly through warfare, diplomacy, and consolidation. In some regions, fortified cities become central points of survival and authority, acting as both military strongholds and administrative hubs. In others, mobile warfare dominates, with cavalry-based forces shaping rapid shifts in territorial control. And across all of this, the idea of empire itself begins to fragment into multiple interpretations. Some rulers see themselves as direct inheritors of Roman authority. Others reject Roman identity, but still adopt Roman methods. And still others create entirely new political identities while still operating in landscapes shaped by Roman infrastructure. This is how Rome continues after Rome, not as a single state, but as a set of systems embedded into new worlds. And this is also where the long historical arc we've been following becomes clearer, because the story is no longer just about one empire rising and falling. It becomes about how imperial systems survive by transforming into successor systems, and how the methods developed under earlier rulers, especially during periods of intense pressure like those experienced under Marcus Aurelius, continue to influence how later societies organize power, even when they no longer recognize the original source. In this broader post-Roman world, the concept of leadership becomes more decentralized. Warriors, local rulers, and regional commanders often hold authority simultaneously in overlapping structures. And survival depends less on centralized control and more on coordination between competing power centers. This is a very different environment from the unified imperial structure of earlier Rome. But the underlying challenge remains familiar: how to maintain stability in unstable conditions. And in that sense, even though the world has changed dramatically, the questions that defined Roman leadership under pressure have not disappeared. They have simply been redistributed across many different systems. Some inherited directly from Roman administrative traditions. Some developed independently, but influenced by Roman precedent. And some emerging entirely from new cultural and military realities. And as this new landscape continues to evolve, it becomes clear that Rome's greatest long-term impact is not just what it controlled, but what it taught others about control itself. Through war, administration, crisis, and adaptation, its legacy becomes embedded in the structure of later powers. Not as a single empire continuing unchanged, but as a set of methods, strategies, and ideas that continue to reappear in new forms across different eras of conflict and governance. In the Western regions, where centralized imperial authority had weakened earlier, new ruling elites establish kingdoms that still rely heavily on Roman administrative foundations. They inherit cities, roads, taxation systems, and legal customs that were never fully erased. But they now rule them under entirely different identities. These are not Roman emperors in a classical sense. They are warrior kings operating in a transformed political landscape. In these emerging kingdoms, authority is often tied directly to military leadership. A ruler must prove legitimacy not only through inheritance or administration, but through the ability to command warriors, secure territory, and protect settlements from constant external pressure. And this is where the Roman legacy continues in a subtle but powerful way. Because even as political identity changes, the structure of governance that Rome left behind continues to shape how these new kingdoms function. Tax systems still rely on Roman methods of collection. Urban centers still operate on Roman infrastructure. Legal traditions still echo Roman codification practices. And military organization, even when simplified, often retains elements of Roman discipline and hierarchy. But alongside this administrative inheritance, a different cultural force begins to define this era. The rise of warrior aristocracies. In these societies, leadership is often earned through battlefield success, loyalty networks, and personal martial reputation. War is no longer something conducted only by centralized imperial armies. It becomes a constant condition of political life. Conflicts are frequent, localized, and often interconnected through shifting alliances. And in this environment, certain warrior cultures develop reputations that spread across regions. Some are known for heavy infantry formations that echo Roman tactical discipline, adapted to new social structures. Others become known for cavalry dominance, mobility, and rapid raids across contested territories. And still others build hybrid systems that combine Roman organizational influence with local martial traditions, creating armies that are both structured and flexible. In the Eastern continuation of Roman authority, where imperial governance remains more centralized under evolved administrative systems, military organization retains more direct continuity with earlier imperial models. Command structures remain formalized, logistics remain highly developed, and strategic coordination across regions is more stable. But even there, the influence of external pressures forces continuous adaptation. No system remains static in this environment. Every structure must respond to shifting military realities. And across both Eastern and Western worlds, one pattern becomes increasingly clear. Survival depends on the ability to absorb and transform inherited systems. This is where the long shadow of earlier Roman leadership becomes visible again. The disciplined, administrative mindset associated with figures like Marcus Aurelius does not survive as a governing ideology in these successor kingdoms. But fragments of it survive in practice, in the emphasis on order during crisis, in the expectation that leadership requires endurance rather than comfort, in the idea that authority is measured by responsibility under pressure, not personal enjoyment of power. These ideas do not remain intact as philosophy in these later societies, but they reappear as habits of governance, especially in moments of instability, where leaders are forced to make decisions under uncertainty with limited resources and constant external threats. And in those moments, the structure of Roman trained thinking becomes indirectly relevant again, even when the culture surrounding it has changed completely. Meanwhile, warfare in this era continues to evolve. Successor kingdoms often fight not for ideological conquest in the modern sense, but for control of strategic resources, agricultural land, fortified cities, trade routes, and river crossings. Campaigns are often seasonal, shaped by terrain and supply constraints. Armies must be able to move quickly, sustain themselves locally, and adapt to shifting alliances. This creates a world where military leadership is highly valued, but also extremely unstable. A successful war leader can become a king. A failed campaign can lead to rapid political collapse. And because of this volatility, political authority is constantly tested. Even established rulers must repeatedly reinforce their legitimacy through military and administrative effectiveness. In some regions, this leads to the emergence of semi-formal codes of warrior conduct, where loyalty, bravery, and strategic intelligence become defining traits of elite military identity. In others, more centralized structures persist, especially where Roman administrative systems remain stronger and more intact. But across the entire post-imperial landscape, one thing is consistent. Power is no longer permanently secured. It must be maintained continuously. And this creates a world very different from the stable imperial ideal that Marcus Aurelius once inherited. Yet, paradoxically, it also creates conditions where his style of reflection becomes relevant again in indirect ways. Because in unstable systems, leaders often return, consciously or unconsciously, to principles of internal discipline, emotional control, and long-term thinking when short-term chaos dominates external conditions. Not because they are philosophically aligned with Stoicism, but because those habits of thought are structurally useful under pressure. And so, even in a world filled with new kingdoms, new warrior elites, and new political identities, certain Roman intellectual patterns continue to resurface, not as institutions, not as empires, but as responses to instability. And that is what ties this entire historical arc together. From unified imperial governance, to fragmentation and reform, to successor kingdoms and warrior societies, the underlying challenge remains the same: how to build and maintain order in a world that constantly resists it. And across all these transformations, the Roman experience continues to echo in different forms, adapted to new conditions, but never fully erased. As the centuries move further away from the core era of the Roman Empire, the world that once revolved around it fully transforms into a different political reality. There is no longer a single center of power that defines the entire region. Instead, multiple civilizations now exist side by side, each carrying fragments of Roman inheritance in different forms, some political, some military, some cultural. In the Western regions, successor kingdoms that once rose from Roman provincial structures have either merged, collapsed, or stabilized into more localized forms of rule. In the East, imperial continuity has evolved into a highly organized administrative system that still preserves elements of Roman law, engineering, and governance, even though it now operates in a very different cultural and religious framework shaped by centuries of transformation under rulers like Constantine the Great and his successors. But at this stage of history, something more important than political continuity becomes visible. Rome has stopped being a place. It has become a method, a way of organizing power, managing territory, and surviving complexity that continues to appear in different forms across different civilizations. And that method did not begin with collapse. It began much earlier in the long arc of imperial development that included crisis, reform, and adaptation. And at the center of that earlier arc stands Marcus Aurelius. Not because he prevented the transformation that followed him, but because he represents one of the last clear moments where Roman power still believed that internal discipline and external authority could exist in the same unified system without contradiction. After him, Rome continues, but it becomes structurally different, more adaptive, more divided, more institutionally complex, and eventually more ideologically transformed. Yet even as political Rome dissolves into successor systems, its deeper legacy does not vanish. It spreads through law codes that influence later governance systems, through military organization that shapes how armies are structured across different regions, through administrative logic that survives in taxation, urban planning, and state coordination, and through philosophical inheritance that preserves ways of thinking about leadership under pressure. Across all these transformations, one pattern remains constant. Every system that inherits Rome must eventually face the same fundamental problem Rome faced at its peak and during its crisis: how to maintain stability when scale exceeds simplicity. This is the problem Marcus Aurelius lived inside. A system large enough to govern millions, but complex enough that no single mind could fully control every outcome. His response was not structural reform alone. It was internal discipline, a continuous attempt to align thought, action, and responsibility even when external conditions were unstable. That is why his writings survive differently than political systems, because systems break, evolve, or fragment, but patterns of thinking can move across them. And as later civilizations rise in the lands once shaped by Roman authority, They repeatedly encounter the same structural pressures: large territories, limited communication speed, military threats, economic strain, and the constant need for delegated authority. In each case, new solutions emerge. Some are centralized, some are fragmented, some combine both approaches, but none fully eliminate the underlying tension between control and complexity. And so the Roman experience becomes something larger than its own historical boundaries. It becomes a case study in how empires behave under pressure, how they adapt, how they reorganize, and how they ultimately transform into something they did not originally intend to become. In that sense, the end of Rome is not a single historical event. It is a long transition from unified imperial identity into distributed legacy. And Marcus Aurelius sits at the beginning of that transition, not its conclusion. He represents the moment just before the system fully begins to reshape itself into something else. After him, the empire does not stop existing, but it stops existing in the same way. And everything that follows, wars, successor kingdoms, administrative reforms, ideological shifts, are all different responses to the same underlying reality. The world had become too large, too complex, and too interconnected to be governed by a single stable model of authority. So it changes, again and again, until Rome is no longer a singular empire in practice, but a layered inheritance spread across civilizations that never fully erase it. And that is the final truth of this story. Rome does not end because it is defeated. Rome ends because it is absorbed into new systems, new rulers, new wars, and new ways of organizing human power. But inside all of those changes, the echo remains. The echo of an empire that once believed order could be maintained through discipline, structure, and responsibility at the highest level of human authority. And the echo of a ruler who tried, more than most, to live as if that responsibility had to be carried not just outwardly, but inwardly as well. And once that idea enters history, it does not disappear. It only changes shape.